Rob here at eTrailer.com, and today you're going to get a really good look at and see how to install the SumoSprings front Rebel helper springs on our 2018 Forest River Georgetown motorhome. Now, whether you're new to driving a motorhome or you've been doing it for a while, you'll realize real quickly how unstable they feel and just kind of how much body roll and uncomfortable the ride is. Because when we're going down the highway, let's face it, there's a lot of area here for that wind to catch, and we end up getting pushed around. So we end up fighting the steering wheel, trying to stay in our lane, or if we're going down some bumpy roads, we end up getting jostled around. By the time we get where we're going, we're extremely tired. Not to mention everybody in the back's getting tossed around. It's just not that enjoyable. So being able to stiffen up the suspension and have a lot more control and stability would be great. So before we put any suspension components on our motorhome, we're going to take it on our test course, have a base run, and see how it handles. As I come up to my slalom course, just to let you know, we're going to be running the course at 10 miles an hour so we can have a pretty consistent reading and we can take out the variables. But as I come in and I start to go around the turns, you can immediately feel the body roll. It's almost like the motorhome wants to lean really hard before it turns. Kind of feels like I just need to slow down a little bit and maybe take the turns a little bit wider so I can make sure that I don't have such a rolling, kind of loose feeling in the motorhome. As I come out to my bumps course, I'm going to be going over the bumps at 5 miles an hour. Now, even those first few bumps, I can already tell clearly that there's a bump, but this is a really rough, almost jarring feeling after I'm going through. It's resonating through the seat. Not to mention, once I get to the alternating bumps, I'm really having to hold on to the steering wheel because it's wanting to turn, kind of lurch over to the side. And even after I get over the bump, you can see that I'm continuing to bounce, and it's just an overall uncomfortable ride. Now that we have our suspension components installed, let's go ahead and take it back on our test course so we can see how much the ride quality improved. As I come up to my slalom course again, I'm going to be going about 10 miles an hour to try to keep everything really consistent. But I can already feel a little bit of a difference just coming into the course. Feels a lot more responsive, and it doesn't want to lean as much as I'm going in or out of the turns, and it genuinely feels like it's handling better and that I could go faster if I needed to. On the bump course, there's an immediate difference. Don't get me wrong, the bumps are still there, but I'm not getting this jarring feeling coming through the seat. It's a lot softer, and the motorhome is reacting much quicker going over the bumps. It's not continuing to bounce after I get over. Not to mention on the alternating speed bumps here, I don't have to have a death grip on the steering wheel and try to fight it to get back to center. It just generally wants to go over and keeps tracking straight. It's greatly improved over the stock suspension. Like I said before, I wouldn't want to drive it, and now this would be a lot more comfortable to drive for a long period of time. So you can see that the overall ride quality did improve greatly, but one thing to keep in mind, we did install more than one component. We went ahead and did the full system, so we have full stability from the front all the way to the back of our motorhome. And that's going to include the Roadmaster front anti-sway bar, the SumoSpring front helper springs, and the reflex steering stabilizer in the front. And then on the rear, we also have the Roadmaster anti-sway bar, as well as the SumoSprings. That way, from the front of our motorhome all the way to the back, we get that extra stability and that comfortable ride. And that's what I'm going to suggest if you're looking to upgrade your motorhome suspension. If you're going to do the front or the back, you might as well do the whole thing. That way we can have that comfortable ride and really maximize the drivability and comfortability of our motorhome. So here's what our SumoSprings look like once we have them installed. Now, I do want to mention that we have our motorhome lifted up by the leveling jacks, and that's why there's a gap right here. But once we put the weight down, the two pieces are going to come together. Our SumoSprings are going to provide us a lot of support and a comfortable ride when we're driving down the road, because they're going to help support those heavy things like the slide outs or anything else that might be towards the front of our motorhome. And whenever we're turning, since they're going to be compressed together, it's also going to help out with a lot of sway and body roll, so we don't have to fight the steering wheel so much and we won't have so much driver fatigue. What I really like about our SumoSprings is the fact that it has this two-piece design. So like I mentioned before, we have it lifted up so they're separated, but once the weight comes down, they're going to come together. The two-piece design is going to come in handy though whenever we go over really rough terrain. Now obviously the pieces coming together, it's going to provide us the support because they're going to start squishing, but when we have the rebound effect of when we get over the bump and the suspension needs to travel upward, we're not going to have to worry about any kind of limitations because we're going to be able to stretch our suspension as far as it needs to go. Now our springs are going to be progressive, and what that means is whenever we have a light load or we're just driving around normally, our springs are going to compress soft and the engagement's going to be softer. But the more weight we put down on it, or the harder it presses down, the stiffer and more support our springs are going to give us. Now since they're polyurethane, they are going to absorb a lot of the road shock, which means they're going to give us a nice smooth ride whether we have a lot of weight or no weight in the front, and they're going to withstand a lot of the environmental issues. So if we're driving through the mountains, we won't have to worry about the temperatures getting to it, or if we're down in the desert, the high temperatures won't damage these either. Our springs will be rated all the way down to -25 degrees Fahrenheit, all the way up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and they're going to resist damage caused by oils, road salts, and UV rays. Our SumoSprings are going to provide us with 2,600 pounds of load leveling support. Now you need to double check your motorhome because these are not going to increase the payload capacity, just there to help support the weight and give us a nice smooth ride. And they are going to come with everything you need to get them installed. The brackets, all the hardware, and both springs. And the best thing I think about these is once they're installed, we can completely forget about them. They're nearly maintenance free, unlike airbags where we're going to have to run airlines, monitor the air pressure, and the installation's a little bit more involved than our SumoSprings here. But now that we've gone over some features and seen what they look like, let's go through the installation together. To begin our installation, we want to park our motorhome on a nice flat level surface. We're going to make sure to put the parking brake on, and we want to use our front leveling jacks just to raise the front end up enough. We don't need to have the front tires come off the ground, but we want to stretch the suspension out so we have some room to work with. Then we'll move right underneath the front and come to the front axle. Now over on the driver's side, if we look right above the axle, right on the frame, we'll have our factory joust stop. Now, there's going to be a bolt coming from the very bottom going all the way through that's holding it in place. So you want to grab a short extension and a 13mm socket. I'm going to just break it loose a little bit. But then we're going to want to grab a 15mm wrench because there's actually a nut on the top side of the frame rail that's holding it in place. So we'll hold that with the wrench and loosen up the bolt from the bottom. We want to hold on to the bolt and the nut, but we can get rid of the joust stop itself. So now we want to grab the upper section of our spring out of our kit. We know it's going to be the upper section because we'll have two bolts attaching it to the top here, as well as an open hole in the bracket, and then the bottom's going to have a large opening. I'm just going to go ahead and pull these two bolts out. We want to detach the bracket but keep the bolts dropped down in there. And we're going to take the bracket and take our factory bolt, and we're going to bolt it in the same spot that we just pulled our joust stop out of. We're going to take our bracket, and we want to push the bolt through the center just like how we had it, but it's very important that we pay attention to these little tabs here on the end of our bracket. We want those to hook onto the inside of the frame, so we're going to set everything up and then we'll push it to the outside. We can take that factory nut, we're going to reinstall it. Now it's okay if it doesn't go on all the way right now, and the bracket's probably going to drop down. But we'll take that 13mm socket and that 15mm wrench and we're going to tighten everything up. But once it gets close, we need to make sure that that bracket is going to hold and those tabs are going to catch the end of the frame here. Now if we grab the top section of our spring, you'll notice we're going to have 4 holes. They're all going to be threaded, but 2 of them are going to line up with our 2 bolts that are coming down. So we want to get them close to lined up. We'll lift up our spring, and then we just want to get a couple threads started by hand so that it'll hold the spring and it won't fall down. Then we can come back with a wrench and tighten them up the rest of the way. Now I'm going to use a 9/16 ratcheting wrench. That'll just speed up the process of tightening these bolts up because we're not going to have enough room to get a socket in there. But if you are using a ratcheting wrench, I do suggest alternating between the two bolts. That way, whenever we tighten it up, we have enough room to pull the wrench out and it doesn't get stuck. Now we can get ready to loosely assemble the lower section of our spring. So we want to grab the lower bracket as well as the lower section of the spring. Now this is going to have the inverted version of the upper spring, so we'll have a piece sticking out and only one hole on the bottom. You want to grab one of the short 3/8 bolts out of our kit, and if we're looking at our bracket, you'll notice that we do have two holes. Well, we want the taller section of our bracket pointing forward and that little tail to be pointing back. And we want to use the inner hole to mount our spring. So we'll put it towards the inside, line up the threaded hole on the spring, and just real loosely get it threaded in place. We don't need to tighten this down just yet. We want it to be hand tight, but still plenty of movement in the spring so we can slide it back and forth and get it lined up. Now we want to take our spring, and again, that large part's going to be pointing towards the front, and that opening is going to straddle right on top of our front leaf springs. So make sure to get it sitting where we want it to. The front bracket should end right at that top leaf spring there. And you just want to make sure that we can get the spring to line up with the upper spring here. So you just may want to slide it back and forth to about where it is, and we can either hold it and use a ratcheting wrench to tighten up the bolt through this opening, or we can move the bracket and tighten up that 3/8 bolts once we have it in the position we want it. And once you have that lower spring tightened up, you want to grab the long carriage bolts, and we'll have two square holes on the very top of the front section of our bracket. We want to drop those down. They go all the way down through the bracket. We'll do that on both sides. And then on the back side of the bracket, we're going to take the shorter carriage bolts and drop it down through the square holes. When we dropped our bolts down through, we want to grab our saddle clamps. We kind of a U shape. We'll slide them so where our bolts come through both holes on each end. And you want that U to be facing upward so that it kind of grabs onto the leaf spring on the bottom. Then we'll take our flange nuts and we'll just loosely get them in place on all our carriage bolts. It's going to be the same combination of hardware for the front bracket, so we'll get that in place as well. I'm going to come back with a 9/16 socket and tighten up all the nuts. Now one thing I do want to mention, I like to alternate, that way we get an even clamping force and it doesn't go up crooked. Now that we have this side on, we're going to repeat that entire process over on the passenger side. Now over on the passenger side, the only thing that's going to be different is when we remove our factory job stop and go to mount the upper bracket. You can see that the frame's going to be blocked off here, and that's alright because up top we're going to have a weld nut. So that nut is actually welded to the frame, so all we need is that 13mm socket. We don't need the 15mm wrench. Everything else is going to be exactly the same on the passenger side. But with all that being said, I'm Rob here at eTrailer.com, and that'll finish up your look at the SumoSprings Rebel Custom Helper Springs on the front axle on our 2018 Forest River Georgetown Motorhome.